this is Alana,
Morgan,
and Nina.
Welcome to Crush Course Ivy History of the Americas.
Today we're going to talk about origins of the Civil War. How did this event that changed the course of American history begin?
How did the deep-rooted issues of the political divisions influence the onset of the Civil War?
Under America's democratic expansion, the two-party system caused the formation of political parties that had conflicting views.
How did the issue of states' rights play a role? We'll take a look at the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, as well as the nullification crisis.
Lastly, how did the tension between the North, South, and newly ordained West affect politics, the economy, and social institutions of the country?
With sectionalism, states' rights, and political divisions rampant, it was almost inevitable that such a riveting war would rock our nation.
Okay, so under President Jackson, there was a two-party system created, which meant that there were allowed to be more than one political party in control rather than just one political party because they all had different viewpoints. They all wanted to be in the government and asserting their viewpoints. So there were two main political parties. It was the Democrats and the Whigs, and President Jackson supported the Democrats more than the Whigs. The Democrats felt that the least government was the best because they were in fear of tyranny because after the British ended their rule, they were really tyrannical and they were autocratic and they were like...
What's autocratic?
Autocratic means one person's ruling and they're asserting all their influence and they're like a tyrannical leader and going crazy, making everybody do what they want. And the USA didn't want that. They wanted to rule on their own. So now they have a fear of central government and a fear of federal power. So that's what the Democrats were in support of, more states' rights. And this caused a lot more issues down the road, but you'll hear about that later. Okay, so they were in favor of low tariffs. They didn't want a lot of taxes on their own imports and exports because they didn't want to pay extra money. After Britain ended their rule, they paid so many taxes. Remember the Boston Tea Party, things like that. So they didn't want any more tariffs than they had to pay. They were done paying extra money.
Stick it to the man.
Yeah. Okay, and then they were in favor of U.S. ban all the way to the West because of Manifest Destiny. Thomas, this one's for you. Okay, and then they had the strongest support in the South and the West, obviously because they favored more states' rights, and the stronger, more populated areas were down in the West. They had a lot of power. They had a lot of money because of slavery and agriculture. And the West obviously supported them because they wanted to be part of the USA. And
America.
Then, go America. Okay, and then the second political party, which was doesn't have as much influence as the Democrats did, were the Whigs. Okay. So they favor government interventions in social and economic matters, which was not the same view as the Democrats because they did not want federal intervention at all. And then they advocated higher tariffs, and they favored government-sponsored improvements such as roads, public works, all that like libraries, schools. And they supported good causes such as abolition, which was a big thing at the time because the slavery was pro-slavery. The South was pro-slavery. And as you can imagine, they were more heavily supported in the North because the North were abolitionists. They did not want slavery. So with all of these issues and tensions between both of the political parties, obviously there were going to be issues down the road. And these issues were the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions and the nullification crisis. Nina, on to you.
Thank you, Morgan. The issue of states' rights was perpetuated by political parties. The states' right issue was deeply rooted in their fear of central power. In the Constitution, in the 10th Amendment, it limits the power of the government to what explicitly was stated in the Constitution. They said all other powers belong to the states. It also stated that each state was guaranteed 2 senators in the Senate, so equal representation. The first major confrontation between people who defended states' rights and those who favored central power was in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts.
Excuse me, Miss Miller?
Yes, me from the future.
What exactly were the Alien and Sedition Acts?
The Alien and Sedition Acts, the Alien Act was restraining or expelling any immigrants when it was at war. The Sedition Act was not being able to speak out against the government, made like riots and publishing. It was just going completely against the First Amendment.
What did it say in the First Amendment? What were the freedoms?
Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press.
Your religion too. Nothing to live. Another major concern during the states' rights time period was the nullification crisis. The reasoning behind the nullification crisis was that there were tariffs put into act. During the 1820s, there were a lot of taxes placed on goods, which only benefited the North, according to the Southerners. They said that their goods were raised in prices, where the North started making more money because of unconstitutional. It's no longer valid. That's basically what it should have been from the beginning of history, but it wasn't because of the corruptness of the government.
The resolution to the nullification crisis, like any other thing in history, was compromise. While determined to uphold federal authority, Jackson urged Congress to make further tariff reductions. Meanwhile, Calhoun and other South Carolinian leaders had become uncomfortably aware of their isolation. Other Southern states opposed protective duties, they supported Jackson. Thus, there was substantial congressional support when Senator Henry Clay, working with Calhoun, came forward with a compromise measure providing for the gradual reduction of all tariffs to a uniform level of 20%. The force bill and the compromise tariff simultaneously passed by Congress on March 1, 1833, promptly received presidential approval. On March 15th, the South Carolina Convention accepted the compromise and withdrew its nullification ordinance. Thus, the crisis ended with both sides claiming victory.
Sectionalism is pretty much the opposite of nationalism. The boring definition would be when regional interests are placed above national interests.
As most of you know, the North and South disagreed on a lot of major topics like slavery, taxes, and role of government. I hope you all know this because this division leads to the Civil War, duh!
One reason for the sectionalism to emerge was when Missouri was trying to be all cool and stuff and applied to become a state. Now you're probably thinking, what was that problem? What was the problem? What's the dealio? Well, Northerners did not want to have another Southern slave state because South would have more influence in the Senate because the more states, the more senators they have to represent them.
Henry Clay in 1820 resolved this by making the Missouri Compromise. What this compromise did was to make it fair, they let Missouri be a slave state. But they broke Massachusetts into two states, Massachusetts and Maine being in the north, counted as a free state, non-slave state.
And so after that compromise, slavery was outlawed in all western territories above the latitude of 3630, which is a fancy way of saying that slavery was banned in all of the future northwestern states.
It's time for the open letter.
You've got mail.
An open letter to John Green. Dear John Green, we love you. You are the reason that we not only passed the AP World exam, but the class itself.
Preach.
And now you're still helping us with Hota. We thought that your job was really easy and that these videos were simple to make, but really they're hard and ours is ratchet. Thanks, John Green. We forever love you. Again.
Perhaps the most pressing issue dividing the nation was slavery. It was so deeply embedded in the U.S., especially in the South, that people had a hard time letting it go. But was slavery really as profitable as it was made out to be?
In fact, 50% of our exports during the 1820s were cotton, thus making the U.S. the king of cotton.
But what is King Cotton?
Thanks for asking that, Morgan. According to the U.S. States Civil War causes, course, and effects that we got in class,
We should know this textbook.
King Cotton ensured that slavery survived and throve. In 1790, only 9,000 bales of cotton were produced in the USA. Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton engine in 1793 revolutionized Southern agriculture. It enabled short cotton fiber to be quickly separated from its seed. Suddenly, it became highly profitable to grow cotton, and Southern farmers cashed in. By the 1830s, the South was producing over 2 million bales per year. Cotton was a major product and high in demand throughout the world. Another negative of this process was that the South would sell their cotton that they had made to the North, and the North would then produce textiles and other manufactured goods. This would not be profitable for the South because of the taxation placed on the goods, and that the North would overcharge for their product to be sold back. The South also lagged in industrial development because of its non-experience, because the North had taken over. So now let's quickly take a look into our thought bubble for the for the conditions that the slaves were in.
The truth about slavery. It was coerced labor that relied upon intimidation and brutality and dehumanization. And this wasn't just a cultural system, it was a legal one. I mean, Louisiana law proclaimed that a slave owes his master a respect without bounds and an absolute obedience. The signal feature of slaves' lives was work. I mean, conditions and tasks varied, but all slaves labored usually from sunup to sundown and almost always without any pay. Most slaves worked in agriculture on plantations, and conditions were different depending on which crops were grown. Like slaves on the rice plantations of South Carolina had terrible working conditions, but they labored under the task system, which meant that once they had completed their allotted daily work, they would have time to do other things. But lest you imagine this is like how we have work and leisure time, bear in mind that they were owned and treated as property. On cotton plantation, most slaves worked in gangs, usually under the control of an overseer or another slave who was called a driver. This was back-breaking work done in the southern sun and humidity, and so it's not surprising that whippings or the threat of them were often necessary to get slaves to work. It's easy enough to talk about the brutality of slave discipline, but it can be difficult to internalize it. Like, you look at these pictures, but because you've seen them over and over again, they don't have the power they once might have. The pictures can tell a story about cruelty, but they don't necessarily communicate how arbitrary it all was, as, for example, in this story told by a woman who was a slave as a young girl. The overseer went to my father one morning and said, "Bob, I'm gonna whip you this morning." Daddy said, "I ain't done nothing." And he said, "I know it. I'm going to whip you to keep you from doing nothing." And he hit him with that cowhide. You know, it would cut the blood out of you with every lick if they hit you hard. That brutality, the whippings, the brandings, the rape, was real, and it was intentional because in order for slavery to function, slaves had to be dehumanized.
So was slavery profitable? Who knows what everybody thinks? Amongst historians and other people in the world, slavery and its profitability is a huge controversy.
With all of the sectional differences dividing the nation, such as the ones mentioned, the North and South were in constant political, economic, and social dispute. This eventually caused the South to secede from the Union and create the Confederacy. All of these tensions culminated in the Civil War, in which the first shot was fired by Confederate soldiers at Fort Sumter. Although the war started because the Southern states wanted to be a separate nation, which they justified by their unique characteristics, slavery soon became a driving force behind the fighting. The war enveloped many of the major issues of the nation at the time. Could the war have been avoided, or was it inevitable? Could Lincoln, the newly elected president, have worked harder to bind the nation despite these regional divisions dividing it? These are both questions that historians still debate today, but no conclusion can really be drawn. One thing we know for certain, though, is that the Civil War happened, and it forever altered the course of our nation.
And a special thank you to Me from the Future, played by Rebecca Miller, John Green for inspiring us, Miss Quinn for assigning this great assignment, and Alan Farmer for this textbook information.
And Raoul Meyer. Thanks, class, for watching, even though you had no choice.
See you next week.
See you next week!